Good afternoon, and welcome to our Lab 7 Flexure and Strain lab presentation. So to introduce this lab, the goal was to learn about the beam theory, which was brought up multiple times during the lab section, which was testing multiple procedures for measuring strain using a persistent force of electricity, which we use a multimeter to help conduct these numbers. The goal is to also be familiar with strain testing procedures and beam bending tests, which will be further explained in the methodology sections. So first, when we first got to the lab, we had to use, we were given a strain gauge, which can be seen in the photo on the right, which is on that black beam underneath the press. And using a caliper first, we had to find the middle of the polycarbonate, which would be used by tracing them over the top side of the strain gauge to help be able to hold it without damaging it. Then we had to use 1 to 2 drops of glue, very minimum, to avoid any cover up of the strain gauge. And we put that on the bottom side, which would be able to glue the bottom on top of the polycarbonate, which would be then placed in the middle of the polycarbonate surface, which we use to find with the caliper. We would hold that in place for about 45 seconds or so to make sure it was firmly in place and it wouldn't move or no wires would break or whatnot. And then we would tape down the wires to the polycarbonate as well, make sure those wouldn't move, stick in place, Next, we had 1 of 2 tests. First of all, we're given this semicircle, which we had to find the radius in inches to help us find all of our further calculations, which we discussed in the results in section. We would place the polycarbonate with the strain gauge, which we talked about in the other slide, on top of the semicircle, which we would then apply a force using our hands, which would fully bend on top of the semicircle. And the strain gauge is attached to the multimeter, which can be seen in the picture to the right. And the multimeter would find the resistance using electricity to help find the strain during this part of the test. Finally, during test 2, we would place the polycarbonate with the strain gauge on top on the 3-point bend fixture, making sure before we do any testing that the dial gauge and the force sensor are zeroed. Again, all of these parts can be seen on the photo on the right. One person turns the force crank clockwise at a constant rate, while another person is recording the entire setup. That way we can get the displacement measurements, the force, and all those measurements to be able to help find the strain and the Young's modulus. And then turn the crank until the press reaches about 6 pounds. We didn't really do too many pounds of force this time around, just because we didn't want to be able to break the polycarbonate. And then we would gather all the data from the recording.
So for our data, we plotted the load versus displacement and stress versus strain graphs, and we found that the linear elastic region spanned nearly the entire graph. And even though they looked very similar, they had very different trendline slopes. The load versus displacement graph had a slope of 33.452, and the stress versus strain graph had a slope of 1,121.1. The beam bending curve plotted using equation 6 that we were given resembles the displacement that we saw during the experiment. As you can see, the lowest point is where the maximum deflection occurred, and if the graph were mirrored, it would look exactly like the beam during the test. The slope from the 2 graphs provided 2 different values for the Young's modulus. The third value was taken from a reference source. That reference source can be found at the end of the slide.
One of the main problems that we encountered while doing the lab was the first strain gauge that we used was actually defective. Now, we properly followed the procedure when setting up the lab, but somehow it's still messed up. This was either due to human error or something that we did, but we don't know. But We contacted the TA, and the TA provided us a pre-made strain gauge, and the experiment went out pretty well. It was conducted pretty smoothly. With the data that we collected, equations 1 and 11 from the lab documents were used to calculate the strain in the material. Equation 1 uses the voltage resistance in the material to calculate the strain, while equation 11 was derived from beam theory. In conclusion, calculating deflection and creating the graphs from the data gathered, the experiment proves beam theory to be accurate. Now, for future work and recommendations, one suggestion that we would give to other groups is to follow the lab setup very carefully. Although this was stressed before lab, we want to stress that again because that plays an important role while conducting this experiment. Another possible solution to this, a possible solution to this would maybe already have the strain gauges already set up for the students. We understand the importance of learning how to set these things up, but considering how expensive and sensitive these gauges are, this would save a lot of time and save the hassle of messing up.
Here's our references. Any questions?